Hey everyone, before we get into this video, I just wanted you all to know that this video will cover serious topics involving children, specifically the abuse of them. If this is something that bothers you for any sort of reason, then this is your warning to click away. Thank you, and into the video. CPS workers of Reddit. What are some horror stories that you've encountered? Worst I've ever heard absolutely turned my stomach. Worked with a lovely, kind, docile, funny guy who had formerly worked on mental health service vans. We were having a slow, quiet day, and he was telling me why he wouldn't do mental health work anymore. He was called to a farm in Wales, where a woman of 21 had been discovered, malnourished with rickets and all manner of other problems. She was chained up in a horse box. She had been kept there from a young age. She had been kept there by her father. The mother was complicit. She was regularly assaulted and beaten not just by her father, but by his friends too. The guy I worked with was obviously hurt by what he saw. He didn't like his part in the process of helping her. He had to pick her up from a police cell where she had been for 2 days. She wouldn't make eye contact and winced and made a squeaking noise whenever men came near. I've heard some nasty stories, but this one is easily the most loathsome. Story 2. From my wife, who works with disabled/abused/otherwise non-standard kids. One day we had a potential new kid for our daycare program. We're showing him the facility, and he noticed a few workers who were replacing a window. Another kid put a chair through it that morning. He looks at them and asks, "What are you butt screwers doing?" We were ever so slightly appalled, but then again, the kid has a rough home life. After the tour, we stuck him in one of the groups to see how he got along with other children. Cue a high-pitched scream and a crying kid. What happened, you ask? The little guy had crawled between a skirt-wearing woman's legs and tried to shove his finger right in her lady bits. When questioned, he stated that he does it with his sister all the time. We later learned that the whole family often watched adult content together. Hello, foster care. And now for the shocker, that little boy was 5 years old. Now seems like a good time to mention that I will not be doing character voices. I just feel like it's in bad taste here, as it is in some other more serious stuff too. So forgive me if it takes away from the entertainment value or whatever, but it just feels more respectful this way. Story 3. One of the worst was a case I was jointly investigating with police, and the teen girl was being constantly touched by her stepfather. The girl told me that her stepdad would always tell her they were lovers in a past life, and they are celestial soulmates, and told her whenever he would bang with his wife, he couldn't keep his dong hard unless he thought of her. The mother knew for years what was going on, but didn't want to leave him. We confronted the mom about the stepdad, and she knew the stepdad couldn't finish unless he fantasized about her daughter. When the detective told the mom she was being arrested, her only response was, "But I have work in the morning." She had no remorse. That will always stay with me. Story 4. I'm not sure you really want to know. I was a case manager for a private nonprofit treatment foster care agency. Right out of college, a worker in a group home for emotionally troubled adolescents. Every time I'd think nothing could shock me, something did. The girl who was removed from the home because her brother abused her. Brother was still at home. A boy sold for drugs at age 2. A girl forced into selling herself by her mother at the age of 13. A girl who lived in fear as a teen that the explicit child content her mother allowed to be taken of her when she was 10 would show up in her future. Learning problems due to head trauma from abuse. So many teenage boys given away by their mothers because mom's new boyfriend didn't like the kid. Pregnant at 12 years old by her own father or uncle. 2 failed adoptions because the kid had too many problems, so adoptive parents returned them like a frickin' pair of pants. A brother and sister so neglected and ignored that they could barely talk at age 4 and 6. And the 2 cases that shocked me the most. A girl of about 12 who had hearing loss in both ears. It seems her father rammed pencils in her ears when she gave his friends a hard time when they were assaulting her. She had nightly night terrors. She was sure her father was coming to get her and was on guard every minute of the day. This was at the group home. No amount of talk about her father being in prison on the other side of the state helped. She found out we weren't allowed to lock the cottage doors and was inconsolable the night I worked the overnight shift. I locked the damn doors and told the higher-ups we needed to do it. She was sure her father would find her and end her, and if I tried to save her, he would end me too. And it would be all my fault that you died, is what she said. The other was a 16-year-old who was gang assaulted by her boyfriend's friends. She said it was about 10 of them. She ended up with numerous STIs, as well as all sorts of scar tissue from the trauma. She ran away from foster care, and guess where she ran? Yep, to her boyfriend. When she was found, she told me it was okay now because she had already been done. No one was ever charged or even arrested. I lasted 10 years in the field. As far as horror stories go, OP kinda knocked it out of the park, huh? The short ones were terrible enough. The 2 they went into depth about are, I don't even know what word to use. Tragic, mortifying, truly just a terrible display of the worst humankind has to offer. My heart goes out to the victims, and I hope they find better places to be and better mental states to be in the future. Although, I know it's easier said than done. Story 5. My agency 30 years ago had a boy that was beaten and forced into helping create child-explicit content. When he was rescued at 8, he had burn marks all over him, and his arms, back, and face had been sliced with a knife. His back had chain whip scars, and his arm was broken so badly it never healed right, and the nerve damage resulted in the need for it to be amputated. The boy spoke with a stutter and was paranoid. He was put into a group home and then a foster home. He was close with his foster family's neighbors and ran away with them when they moved away. He wasn't found until he was 21, so he was legally allowed to stay with them. We didn't work with him since he ran away, but 2 years ago I saw him being interviewed on TV. He was shockingly healthy looking, no stutter. I hope he found the peace and love he deserved with the family he ran away with. Story 6. I worked with a family where the mother and her 2 children under the age of 4 were held hostage and savagely abused, at times with loaded firearms, and brutally tortured for a few months before they were able to escape. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the images of their mangled bodies from that first night I saw them in the ER, barely recognizable as humans. I think the hardest part of that whole story is that the children are in custody and flourishing, but the plan is reunification with the mother, who is back with the abuser. Another time, a little girl was complaining to her teacher about her down there hurts because Daddy was rough with her. Turns out Daddy admitted he liked to make videos of himself assaulting his single-digit aged daughter. He planned on showing them to his wife in the event she didn't want to bang him. I've also had other cases that are bad, but not as traumatic to experience as a worker, like a mom who tried to sell her children on Craigslist, physical abuse that causes broken bones but goes unreported, and mental health issues that affect how well a mother can take care of her kids. I was surprised by how a lot of my assumptions about being a CPS worker have been completely shattered by the families I encountered as an intern in a forensic unit. It wasn't the poor and downtrodden that I interacted with most of the time, but the middle-class white family that would go unnoticed. It really blows my mind. Story 7. I think I may be too late, but here it is. I was working as a social worker and got called for an emergency case. I had to drive 3.5 hours south to pick up a 3-year-old girl. The only information I got was be prepared for a bad case. When I got to the hospital where the child was at, I was led to the room where the child's aunt and the child were. The aunt had no emotions towards me. The child, however, was a bit nervous but was ready to be held. I was in a bit of shock. I was not warned that the child had open, oozing burns over her face, head, stomach, and legs. I was prepped by the nurses, then told I would be transporting the child and aunt back up north. The entire ride I talked with the baby and sang to her. I had to make several stops to hold her and soothe her. The aunt said nothing. Right before dropping the aunt off, she asked me if she could take the baby. I told her no. She had to go to the caregivers. No other discussion. Aunt walked off without saying goodbye to the baby. I drove baby to the caregiver, introduced them. The baby did not want to leave me. I tried to get the caregivers to give her a gift, feed her, nothing worked. Finally, I just had to leave. I left out the back door. When I looked back, I heard the baby screaming, and I could see her staring through the window crying. I drove away. Halfway home, I vomited because the thought of leaving her made me ill. I felt as though I too abandoned her. Most cases don't get to me. This little girl did. I found out later the burns were from her mother accidentally dropping a pot of boiling water on her head for the second time. Story 8. Intake investigator here. The stuff I see is ridiculous. Walked into an active drug lab that was set up in the same room a little girl was sleeping in. Found a wandering 2-year-old. It was 5 hours before the parents realized he was missing. The cases where I actually do get a removal order, prepping for court and having to defend why the agency felt the parents couldn't parent, that's almost as bad as investigating the allegations. Babies that haven't eaten in days, homes that are so unkempt the homeless wouldn't even squat in them, the parents who need mental health services but refuse, same for the parents who need substance abuse treatment. I see more drug-related allegations than anything. It's one of the most frustrating jobs ever. We have no authority, people don't have to let us in or take drug screens or talk to us at all. Our hands are so tied that I can't believe we actually can substantiate allegations. People don't realize that we try to intervene, or place services with the families to prevent future maltreatment, but we're unable to do so because parents feel that they don't need the help, or they dodge the workers' attempts at making contact. In my state, we only have so many days to complete an investigation, and then we have to close it to stay within state-mandated time limits. It's hard work, but for the few kids who you can help, it means the world. I can't even fathom having to do this job and know that there are plenty of children I could not help. An absolutely heartbreaking reality when it comes to systems surrounding this kind of stuff. People who do the work, though, are absolute saints, and I will stand by that. It takes some powerful mental fortitude to make it through this kind of work. Hats off to you guys. Story 9. I work for CPS and am still fairly new to the agency. Most of the time, reports of abuse and neglect do not result in kids needing to be removed, so at least there's that. My most interesting case involved a 12-year-old girl who was a registered offender. She had touched her siblings and the parents called CPS to ask for help because they weren't sure how to handle it. The girl ended up being charged. I'm not sure why she wasn't given some sort of inpatient treatment program instead, but she was put on the registry. Her PO called CPS in my state when she and her family moved out here. Poor kid, she wasn't allowed to swim with her siblings, couldn't go to school, couldn't go to the park, her siblings couldn't have friends over, etc. Just had a case where the mom was on probation for working with the cartel. Not gonna give a lot of information on that, but it was definitely concerning. The frickin' cartel. One of my coworkers had a Munchausen by proxy case. This poor girl had so many surgeries and was so messed up that her mother had everyone convinced the girl was paralyzed. We got involved when the girl was 16 years old. She ended up graduating with a 4.0 and going to college, so it at least ended decent. Story 10. I worked in a group foster home for teen girls. We had several very severe abuse cases come through, but the worst was a 12-year-old girl from a family of 6 kids, all of whom were in various foster home placements after their mother was charged with 4 counts of felony child abuse. She and her sister were regularly locked outside with no jacket in Wisconsin winter if they aggravated her mother, including one time when my client was left outside overnight in her pajamas. Her mother hit her with a piece of plywood with nails in it more than once. The mom withheld food from her kids as punishment for days. Mom would leave and go to Milwaukee for days at a time, leaving the kids aged 4 to 12 to fend for themselves. Their home was regularly without electricity or water. Mom's various boyfriends abused and assaulted the female children regularly, and Mom would beat the kids if they resisted. But I would say the most horrible thing about this case was how incredibly deep the psychological damage to this girl was. She was just mentally and emotionally wrecked. She was the kid who finally broke down and told someone at school about the abuse. She wanted to end her own life and regularly self-harmed because she was absolutely racked by guilt for tearing the family apart and not keeping her mouth shut. Her mom would call from jail and scream these things into the phone. She had serious issues with food, due to mom not letting them eat, to the point where she would regularly steal food and hide it around her room and eat it at night. Her mother severely beat all of the kids in the bathroom, so my client wouldn't shower for days and cry the whole time she finally did. She showed overly intimate behavior after years of abuse, and developed an obsessive/stalker-ish relationship with an older girl. There was a point when we had to go into her room and remove anything with a cord, all her shoelaces and belts, and anything she could use to cut herself, because we were quite sure she would take her life if given the chance. But she was also terrifyingly violent. She had blown out of 6 foster homes before ending up with us. In one case because she beat her foster sister up. She attacked another girl in our house. She destroyed most of her clothes in a fit of rage. She trapped 2 staff people in the office and threatened to end us. She whipped a phone at my head. She tried to smash the staff computer. She wrote a short story graphically describing how she would end a staff member she didn't like. As terrible as the physical abuse was, the amount of pain and suffering and psychological damage she had gone through was way more horrifying to me. She's going to need years of serious and intense therapy to get back to a safe place. But she's so unstable and hurt that she pushed away anyone who tried to help her. She was eventually removed from our house due to her violent outbursts. And I really hope that she was sent to a secure facility to get intensive treatment. Story 11. I worked very briefly in CPS for Sacramento County, California. Though I wasn't a social worker, my job involved going through all of the social workers' reports. I could tell a million stories of assault, touching brutality, abuse, and violence. But honestly, the thing that stuck with me within the first week was how incredibly cyclical and predictable it all seemed. I wasn't shocked so much by the individual acts themselves, because it's easy to write them off as fluke events. Sick people do sick things, right? But the truly sick part, the part that in a weird way made me feel personally guilty, was that you could see in these reports and in the testimonies that public policies were largely at fault for the situations. Not only that, but many of these now abusive, neglectful, or simply absent parents were once, as children, part of the CPS system. I don't know how far back California's CPS have records, but the ones I was dealing with often went back 2 generations. So you could see how the parent and often the grandparent were also once innocent victims of the same abuse their kids are now suffering. Bear in mind, though, that we're often talking about teen moms, so it's not uncommon for the grandmother to only be in her 30s, the mom still in her teens or 20s, and the kid just a toddler or a preteen. Also, over 90% of the cases involved substance abuse by the adults. Even if the incidents didn't directly involve drugs, whether it was something hard like H or Coke or alcohol or prescription pills. individuals, there was just a lot of drug use. A lot of these kids were also in the system because their parents and grandparents were in jail or prison for drug possession. Not that the adults were saints, but it was clear that the kids weren't being sent to foster care for any reason other than the fact that every adult blood relative in the area was in the prison system for minor drug offenses, solicitation, or other related charges. I was always against the war on drugs, and that experience did nothing to tamp down my opposition. In fact, it inflamed it. I felt really frickin' mad. 20 years ago, the grandma got arrested for possession of H, and the mom had to go into foster care or live with distant relatives where she was touched. The mom has a kid as a teenager, and now she's a drug-addicted escort, and her daughter's been taken away to go back into the foster care system where she's also being touched, hence the latest report. I read this same story, only slightly altered, every single day. And I don't mean to insult or accuse anyone who works in foster care. What they do is amazing and they deserve our respect. My aunt and uncle were in foster care for many years, and I know how hard that work is. It's one of the most generous jobs any person could ever undertake. But naturally, any job that involves close and frequent contact with minors is going to attract its share of bad people. And because we're so insane that we lock people up for minor possession offenses, including moms and dads and other guardians, we overwhelm the system with their kids, and that stresses the screening process to the breaking point. I think a lot of creeps get through because of it. Arresting people for narcotics possession rather than giving them treatment, and unlike AA, treatment that works, breaks up families and continues the cycle. It puts kids in danger, leaving them with strangers and often in the care of abusers. It's been going on for 40 years. We really need to stop this. I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but it's important to point out that the war on drugs doesn't just hurt the individuals who are unjustly incarcerated, it also breaks up families and ultimately endangers children, which only repeats the cycle. No, addicts can't be good parents. It's true, but you need to have a drug policy that emphasizes recovery rather than punishment. Otherwise, you'll never break the cycle. It was rare that I handled a case of child abuse where this wasn't just an echoing of earlier incidents in the parents' and grandparents' lives. I realize this might be somewhat tangential to the original point, but just remember this the next time some soccer mom gets on television blaring, "Think of the children," as if it were a proper rebuttal to sane drug policy. Do, in fact, think of the children. You can save a lot of lives, both literally and figuratively, by getting rid of these draconic laws. Story 12. Had a case where the mom was voluntarily handing her kids over, since she actively wanted to end her own life. My coworker and I went out to serve the court paperwork to gain custody of the 3 kids. 4 to 10 months. We get there and mom is obviously upset. I speak with her to let her know the process, when court will be, where the children will be, visitation schedule. Everything is going as smoothly as a removal can be. Kids were ready to go. We had the car seats ready. When the kids are in the cars, my coworker and I confront her about the report we got about her slashing her wrist. She shows it to us, and we tell her we aren't leaving until she goes to the hospital voluntarily or we call EMS. She starts becoming a bit defensive, saying she'll go tomorrow. We don't really leave her a choice at that point, since we just removed her kids and didn't want her to end her life. She goes into her friend's house, she was also homeless, for a bit, to grab some stuff before her crisis worker takes her to the same hospital we're taking the kids. We get physicals on all kids we take into custody. Mom ends up in the waiting room before us, and since she's been pretty forthcoming, I ask if she wants to help me check the kids in, since they are her kids. That's when I noticed she was completely glazed over. I immediately tell my coworker to escort the kids away from the mom, and I ask what she's on. H and alcohol. Literally not even 10 minutes earlier, she was fine. Mom's escorted off the premises since she became belligerent. You think that would be the end of the story, but it's not. The kids are seen in triage and I have the baby in my arms and he's fussy, really fussy. I don't have kids of my own, but I know when a kid is tugging on his ear and is fussy, he probably has an ear infection. But he was hot to the touch. I had the nurse see the baby first. He had a fever of 104.7. He was immediately taken to a room to bring his temp down. The 2-year-old had severe dental decay, and the 4-year-old was just there, keeping herself together. It was one of the longest nights I've had, and the only time I've ever cried once everything was done. When I dropped the kids off at their new foster home, all 3 of them started crying. The older 2 were screaming to not leave them alone. They didn't do this when their mom left, they did when I left. I guess it was one of the few times that they had affection. In hindsight, I'm thankful the mom called us when she did, or else that could have been a dead child. The kids have been adopted, as mother couldn't stay clean long enough for a successful reunification. I think it's very easy to be hard on this mother, and I think she deserves criticism for sure, but credit where credit's due. Recognizing you are not at all fit to raise these children and things are going poorly, it's not an easy thing to do. And so I do have to throw a bit of respect on the fact that she called for herself. I hope that she has managed to go through recovery of some sort and is clean now, because at the end of the day, that's the ideal scenario, that she heals and becomes better, for lack of a better word. Not that she's punished for anything, at least in my opinion. Story 13. I work in a crisis treatment center in New England. We often get kids brought in who have endured unfathomable abuse and neglect. The story that stands out to me the most involved an 8-year-old girl I met about 3 months into this job. I just transferred to that particular unit and was unfamiliar with her case. I noticed she had extreme attachment issues. She was desperate for attention, and I was warned to be careful when walking by her room at night because she would often pleasure herself in bed. Anyway, at the end of my shift, I read up on her case, and what I found still makes my stomach turn whenever I think about it. The girl's biological father was never in the picture, but mom and her live-in boyfriend started abusing her from the age of 2. The boyfriend would make her perform oral on him and then urinate on her after he finished. They also groomed her to perform oral on her 7-year-old brother when she was 5. Eventually, she was taken out of the house and put into a foster home, where she was forced to take part in an explicit club. Honestly, I don't know how that never became a public scandal, especially because it's a small state. The girl eventually ended up with a pre-adoptive mom with whom she seemed to do well. That is, until it emerged that the mom was diagnosed with a DID. Whether or not one believes this is a real thing is for another time. Regardless, the woman had severe mental issues. This poor girl had the worst body odor I had ever smelled, and it was difficult to get her to shower. She went to a long-term program. Again, ours is only for crisis stabilization, and I've recently moved, so I doubt I'll ever see her again. But I know I will never forget her story, and I wish her the best of luck. Story 14. There is a pretty horrific case in my hometown that resulted in a federal investigation of the county's CPS practices. This 8-year-old boy was physically and mentally abused for many years. He regularly had bruises, broken bones, burns, ligature marks, etc. His mom and her boyfriend would send him to school in girls' clothes to humiliate him. The case had been reported to CPS by teachers, medical staff, and even neighbors. There was an active worker on his case. Neighbors would hear terrible screams, see the boy bruised, etc., but felt helpless because CPS was already aware of the case. Police would be called to the residence only to leave soon after. Last year, the poor boy died after a marathon torture session by the parents. Neighbors heard horrific screams, loud banging noises, etc., but nobody came until the next day where his body was discovered. It caused a lot of anger from the community, including suspension of every CPS worker on the case, and the rest going on strike asking for better working conditions. There were simply too many cases per worker, and many of them felt like this could have been avoided if there was proper staffing. Story 15. Texas CPS here going on for 5 years. I'm an MSW and now paid about $46,000 a year and receive great benefits. I would like a different job, but it would have to pay around $55,000 to be worth it for me, so I'm still with CPS. Anyway, worst cases. Dead toddler who was beaten and assaulted over the course of a day while mom was at work because she wet her pants. I had to photograph all the bruises and what he did to her private areas at the hospital. Sometimes I see those pictures in my head still. Dad casually counting to how he licks and fingers his 5-year-old daughter because, and I quote, "I don't know why." Girl who had to have several surgeries to repair her feet because her dad and brothers disciplined her by beating her feet with 2x4s with nails in them. Dad spewing hate about CPS to anyone who will give him a second. But what really happened is he admitted to assaulting his 2 young daughters since they were in diapers after children disclosed and were screened at the hospital. Despite these being typical cases, we are often called child stealers by the public. This job is not for people who think the world is an alright place. Story 16. I have worked in CPS for 4.5 years now. I've seen pretty much everything you could think of in situations such as these. I have far too many horror stories that would take a long time to write. In the interest of time, here are some memorable encounters. 1. One case, affectionately dubbed the Crappingtons by me, had a family of 4 living in a trailer. They had no running water in the house, so they would literally crap in the toilet until it formed into a mountain. When that filled up, they started crapping in the tub. When they filled that, they punched a hole into the bathroom floor and crapped into that until it reached the hole. The kids would bathe by getting buckets of water dumped over their heads from a neighbor's hose. The kids described not liking showers because they could feel it, the crap, squishing between their toes. 2. One family was selling H by stuffing the kids' socks with the stuff, and they would meet up with their buyers on a bathroom break during study hall. 3. There is a lot of intimate abuse. A lot. I'm honestly surprised at some of the stuff kids would reveal that is just their life. They didn't think of it as out of the ordinary or anything to have daddy take their pants off and wipe them extra clean down there or something to that effect. 4. The saddest and most horrific thing I can think of about CPS, however, is the fact that most people in our system do not see children as children. They see the fact that they banged and either carried the child for 9 months or was responsible for another doing so as making them automatically qualified to be the best parent. If we're doing something they don't agree with, then screw what's best for their child, what's best for them? What do they get out of it as parents? The system is flawed. Children are often in it for years, and there's a lot of turmoil, guilt, and drawn-out situations for these kids. I try to be like their older sibling, to try and make it so they have someone they can relate to and talk to. I'm younger than a lot of the people in my agency, so I tend to relate to them more. But the unfortunate fact is that those very same rules, the fact that they are the biological parents, gives them certain rights right off the bat. It doesn't matter how good or terrible of a person you are, you have rights as a parent. Hell, there are even kids who literally attach a parental role to me just because I'm older than them and I'm nice. I repeat, there are some children who think I am their parent just because I don't verbally, intimately, or physically abuse them. Most parents fail to realize that they cause their child even more undue anguish because of the stunts they pull, the sob stories they give in court as to why they couldn't attend parenting, the lies about domestic violence to garner sympathy, the missed phone calls or appointments because they're poor and can't be held responsible for those things. If you can't afford to buy a bus ride, how can you afford a child? These are things they do not see. They only see the fact that they are the parents and they will find a way. However, they also want to find a way to continue to lie to us so the kids can stay out of the system, so they can keep smoking weed or drinking heavily or continue the relationship with their abusive paramour. Meanwhile, their child is left to flounder in a broken system for such a long time, while their parents lie, cheat, and steal as much as they can to try and manipulate the system for their children. I apologize for sounding bitter, and I really am sympathetic toward everyone when they come into the system, at least initially. However, I've been burned far too many times, and seen too many fallen tears to justify why some people act the way they do. I do not deny the love for your child, especially if you show up for visits consistently, or do what you need to do consistently. But if you show up once a month in the hopes of just having a chance at getting your kid back so you don't look like a failure of a parent, then realize your love of being right outweighs the love for your child. And that is what horrifies me the most about my job. Story 17. I work for the state a few times a year as an actor, role-playing abused children to train CPS workers, police, and others who conduct interviews of abused children. We get a child's backstory to memorize, and we have to understand and accurately portray the way the child thinks, behaves, and responds to questions. This training is vital, as children have a fluid notion of fantasy and reality that can easily be changed by the process, and the wrong people can end up in jail or guilty people can end up back on the streets. The most difficult thing about the job is living these horror stories in your mind and realizing these are all true. The people who created the program use real case histories for all the characters we play. I tell you, some people are hard. Maybe the job doesn't bother them, but from the mind of a child, they add to the trauma. The interviewers who connect, calm, and help the most are those who take it a little personally and allow themselves to be affected. I have ultimate respect for CPS and police who do this job. The burnout rate must be high, and that's tragic because their work is so important. I obviously don't have a lot of input for stories like these. I mean, how many times can I say this person's awful or whatever, right? That aside though, I think once again it is important for these stories to be told. I've said this before on serious sort of topics on the channel, and I'll say it again. Hearing these stories, knowing these sorts of things happen, if you're in the space to take in this kind of information, can help grow your empathy, understanding of the world, and at a very base level, at least your respect for CPS workers. And so I think there is value in telling them, although it is serious and dark. As always at the ends of these videos, I will encourage you to do whatever makes you happy for a bit. Relax, play games, play music, listen to music, whatever. Just take some time for yourself, decompress, and just chill. For now though, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.